Monty Python. Monty Python deserves special recognition in the history of television. Here's a big foot coming down and squishing it. Toe, toe, toe. Stepping down. Monty Python. Um, so what happened with Monty Python? It's a long story, and if you want an interesting read in television history, read on Monty Python. But what it was is these guys who were the producers, John Cleese. Uh, John Cleese was the only one in the cast who was actually a TV star. He had a recurring role in another television program in England where he was a fake newscaster. Um, but other than that, none of the rest of them had any screen time. But it was John Cleese, Michael Palin, Terry Jones, Terry Gilliam. I can't think of their names. But the thing about these guys, they were all comedy writers, and they had been writing for different television shows on the BBC. And at the time, the BBC was doing television shows live. So these guys were writing scripts for live television shows, like we have Saturday Night Live today. These were the comedy writers who wrote for that type of show. And they were all frustrated because they felt like they had comedy to share that wasn't being seen. They couldn't get it delivered the way they wanted. So they took some time and negotiated a special contract, and it's a whole big long story about how they got this contract. And finally, the BBC relented and said, okay, we're going to give you 6 episodes. It's going to air at midnight on Sunday, right before our sign-off. And they're like, sure, fine, 6 episodes, no problem. So they scripted out these 6 episodes. They spent like months scripting out because they wanted to show exactly what they want. The thing about Monty Python that you got to understand, these were people who understood the mechanics of comedy. And they were doing sketch comedy. And a sketch comedy usually runs about 3 minutes, okay? And every comedy sketch has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the guys from Monty Python, they knew they had to have a beginning to set the thing up. They had to have a middle because that was the funny part. But the ending was just the resolution, and it had nothing funny about it. So they cut the endings. If you watch Monty Python, virtually none of their sketches have an ending. They go, here's the beginning, here's the funny part, and we're on to something else. They knew the ending wasn't funny, so they cut it off. And they would do transitions to get from funny to the next funny. And they didn't bother with the conventions. So, the simplest transition they had was John Cleese sitting at a news desk saying, and now for something completely different. Boom, you're into something completely different. They also did, there was one sketch that ended on a man on a street walking away confused or something. I forget what that sketch was. But then John Cleese comes walking through, kicking his legs up in the air, all funny, and he's walking kind of goofy across the street. And the camera's following this guy walking really weird. And then he goes into this door, closes the door, and the door says, Ministry of Silly Walks. And suddenly you're into this sketch that's called Ministry of Silly Walks. One of my other favorite transitions was there was a Viking sketch. And then from the sky, above the stage, on the wires, these 2 old ladies come drifting down onto the set, and they sit down at a table in the middle of the Viking sketch, and they go, I don't like spam. And then they're onto the spam sketch. This was genius. And then the other thing they would do was they had Terry Gilliam do animations. Whenever they got stuck, they would call Terry Gilliam and say, we need an animation to get from this point to that point. So Terry Gilliam's basic instructions were, this is point A, this is point Z, you fill in everything in between, and you have this much time to fill. Okay, so he just do some elaborate doodle animation, something to get from point A to point B, point Z as it was. And the end result was these guys came up with a stream of consciousness television show. It was bizarre. And it's very challenging. I mean, it's a very complicated type of show to produce. It's actually genius. If you go back and watch it again, it's understandable why it was a little controversial and hard to understand. And it's also understandable that it's aged and people have kind of gotten over it. But it really was a comedic high note in the history of television. And by the way, that leads me into SNL. SNL has a brilliant history if you want to go back and look at it. But they kind of based their concept on what Monty Python was doing. Monty Python was too edgy for American television. And whether it was edgy, I don't know. I think it was just too stream of consciousness. It didn't quite fit. There's actually a whole lawsuit Monty Python gets into where they have to sue for the rights to their show because the American producers tried to put commercials into it, and they were arguing that you're destroying the creative content by putting commercials in. But that's another story. But SNL's biggest weakness as a comedy show is it has to play to the length of the break of the program. So where most comedy sketches kind of have a natural beginning, middle, and end, SNL is forced to make their comedy sketches fit a predetermined time. And very few of their sketches can actually last more than, in general, very few sketch comedy pieces can last more than 5 minutes, or more than 3 minutes, I should say. And SNL is forcing them to go through 5 and 6 minutes. And that's their biggest limitation, is they're forced into that. If they could cut it down and make it shorter, they could make it funnier. But they don't have that luxury because they have to fill the amount of time that's allocated by the program parameters. The news desk is an interesting story on SNL. Originally, the idea of the news desk was Chevy Chase was the head writer on the show, and they would put the news in the middle of the program. And the idea was Chevy would host the news to give the actors a moment to regroup. And they would, while Chevy was on stage doing the newscast, all the actors could regroup backstage and figure out what it was they had to adapt for the last half of the show. It was kind of a little powwow moment for the actors to regroup before the second half of the show. And just inadvertently, what wound up happening was the news was the most popular section on SNL. It became literally the anchor point of the show. That was not the original intention, but it took off so big that the news segment of the show got bigger and bigger, and it became more crucial that was the moment we had to hit just right, because that's where they win. That's where SNL's strong point is. So SNL is a whole other chapter I can get into. Monty Python, SNL, and the Smothers Brothers are all shows that kind of all hit on the same theme. They all deserve some attention to be covered and correctly.